Hi everyone, welcome back to TaraChessAcademy. Today we're going to be looking at a game played by Mikhail Botvinnik and Isaac Boleslavsky. So Boleslavsky was known for this line. Currently his variation is remembered like this in the French, with knight f6 and going for this sort of Steinitz setup and playing the bishop to e3 and then following with the queen to d2. So this was Boleslavsky's variation as white, and here Boleslavsky is playing the French as black. We have e46, b4, d5, and now knight to d2. So this is the Tarrasch. And now c5. E captures on d5, e captures on d5. And after white will eventually take on c5, black will be left with this isolated queen pawn. So white would want to look for trades of pieces and try to control this d4 square, and black would want to try to go for some sort of activity. So here, Botvinnik plays bishop to b5 check, knight to c6, knight f3, and now this pawn can't be taken yet because of the pin on the knight. So bishop to d6, castles, and knight to e7. So now we have this isolated queen pawn, and knight to b3 attacking the bishop, bishop to b6, bishop e3, offering this trade of bishops. Boleslavsky accepts, and first Botvinnik captures the knight on c6, and if the knight recaptured, then white could even just play a move like rook to e1 and then recapture with the rook. So if there's something like d4, this would just be a free pawn because the bishop would be pinned here. So white would be doing well in this position. Black could still castle and continue the game, but white has a pretty good position. Instead, b captures on c6, and now f captures on e3, castles, queen d2, queen b6, queen c3, rook b8, rook a b1, rook e8, and we'll just go through these opening moves, and our focus will be on the endgame that happens later on. But we should also notice how the opening flows into the middle game, which goes into the endgame. So it's important to see this transition. So knight g6, knight c5. Now Botvinnik's just planting the knight here, and after bishop g4, with the idea to capture and double white's pawns, Botvinnik just goes knight to d4. Now he's blocking this d5 pawn, and he's also preparing to cement his knight on c5. Knight to e5, and now b4, rook b to d8, and now Botvinnik opens the position with e4. So captures, rook captures on e4, a5, and here Botvinnik just wants to maintain the b4 pawn here, just supporting the knight. And now f6, rook e1, and both sides play king h8 and king h1. So here, Boleslavsky played the move bishop to d7, but as we'll see, that move was a mistake. But he was afraid of something like maybe bishop to h5. Now the knight could go to e6, attacking the rook. And if this rook moves, like let's say to d6, white has a very strong exchange sacrifice with rook captures on e5. Now queen captures on e5. attacking on g7 and the bishop on h5. So white also has this nice knight on e6 and c5, so white has a really good position and should just be winning after just capturing the bishop. So instead he could have probably played something like this, trading the rooks, and then ending up in a position like this, where Botvinnik still has chances to press. But he goes bishop to d7 just to control this 6 square. And now here you can pause your video and try to figure out what the combination that Botvinnik played was. So here, this combination is pretty deep, but we'll just go through a few moves. So first, the knight captures on g7. Now you can't capture with the knight because this would just lead to basically just the loss of the game. You could delay with knight to f8, but white would just be winning. So rook captures. And now here's the stunning move that Botvinnik had predicted in advance. So you can once again pause your video and try to figure out how Botvinnik exploited Black's position here. So here Botvinnik played the move queen captures on c6. Now the queen could be captured by the knight, but we'll see that would just lead to a checkmate after rook captures on e8. And if the queen captures, then the knight would capture on c6. And let's say if the rook goes to c7, Botvinnik could just trade into this position when rook captures on c2 wouldn't work because once again back rank mate on e8. So instead he plays queen to d8. Now knight f3, pressuring this knight on e5. Rook to c7. And again another nice move from Botvinnik. So here he goes knight captures on e5. So he could also just move the queen. But after knight captures on e5, he leads to get this forcing position, which will transition into a better endgame for him. So first of all, if the rook would capture on c6, there would be the fork knight f7. And after knight captures on d8 and rook captures on d8, white can just play the move c4, and then the pawns start to quickly push forward with like b5 and c5 also threatened. So white would be winning in that position. But f captures on e5. And now plays the move queen captures on e8. And the idea is after the queen takes, rook will take, and wherever the queen will go, next move will be rook e8. So the queen can't go to a square like a4, because then the rook would come to e8 and it would be a checkmate. So the queen would have to stay on this back rank. But if it does that, here this would also be a checkmate. So the only move would be the queen on g8. And now white has the move rook to e8, winning the queen. The rook captures on c2, rook captures on g8, and king captures on g8. So now it's time to pause and evaluate this position. So here we have the start of the endgame, and Botvinnik is one pawn up. He has this passed b pawn, but he could easily lose the pawn if he played a move like h3. Then the rook would come behind the pawn to b2, and there's two squares where the rook can defend this pawn. He can defend from e4, which would be like the second best square, just because you control some of these squares, and also you can just get your king up also, but you're not threatening to push your pawn. But you could also come here But if we look at this position, so let's say white just pushes the pawn like this, then this rook would just be stuck here. So the rook would be stuck behind this pawn, and that would not be a good place for the rook to be. But instead, the rooks like to be behind the passed pawn. So when you're having an advantageous position or defending, you want to have your rook on b1. So this is the start of the endgame here. Now, king to f7. Botvinnik just pushes his pawn. He doesn't want to push it too far now, because after a move like rook to b8, if we look at this position, black is coming for the pawn, and if we try to go for these pawns, we'll see that white just isn't in time here. So if the king were to go to f4, king c7, and black would be perfectly fine here. So stops the pawn here, and now he just activates his king, another very important part of the endgame. And now his idea is, once the king has come from d5 to c6 to attack this pawn, now he plays king to g4, and he gives Boleslavsky the option to capture on b6, but as we'll see, this is a losing endgame. So instead, Boleslavsky plays king to b7, but if he captures on b6, we'd have the following position. When the king is already on g4, and it can just come to f5, and now this would just be a simple win with the king coming after the pawns. So here, after king to g4, both the king and rook are paralyzed and can't move away from their post here and capture the pawn. So king to b7, now just blocking the pawn and just giving this rook some freedom to move now. So now Botvinnik plays a very accurate move here, and you can once again pause your videos and try to figure out what's the best continuation for white here. So in this position, Botvinnik played the move rook to e1, and there's two factors of this move. The first is that if the king were to capture, the rook would come back, and we would once again enter this endgame where the king is very far off and white would just come and collect these pawns. So this pawn is actually tactically defended, but now also once the rook comes to g8, his idea is he can defend this pawn from here, and now he'll create some play on the king side now. So this pawn is nicely defended. So we'll see his following plan. His idea is to come with h4, h5, and h6 and trade this pawn, and then eventually just pressure this pawn and just have this g pass pawn. So king to g5, king to b7, h4, and Botvinnik is continuing with his plan. g4, he hides his king, and now he comes in with h6. And now both the king and the rook are completely stuck here in defending both of these pawns. The king has to control the promotion, and the rook has to just control and defend this pawn. So black has a really passive position here, and white's pieces are much better. And in a rook endgame, these are the only pieces. So if both of these pieces aren't doing good, it's very important to the position. King to h5, king a6, Now rook c6, and a very nice plan by Botvinnik. He goes rook c7, and this endgame would just again be completely lost after capturing here and just pushing this pawn up to promote. So instead, rook e5 check, and now he captures, and he's just left with one pawn. So now king c6, king to h6, king d6, d6, rook to e1, rook f7, and now he comes back with his rook f2, and now g7, threatening promotion. Now black starts to give some check, and here this is called the Lucena position, where the king comes and hides behind this pawn, and that's the only place where the king could go. And we'll see the winning technique, which is nicely shown by Botvinnik here. King to e7. So if we get a move like rook to f7, the king would just stay on e8, and we wouldn't have made any progress. So the way to go in this position is, considering that both of these squares are taken away, first the rook wants to check the king away. Now if the king comes to d7, then it's 2 files off from this pawn, and that will end up being important, as we'll see. But rook to e4, rook to h2, king to f7, and now we just have this. This is a strange plan if you don't know it, but the idea is that rook will build a bridge, or kind of like a barrier, against this rook that's checking, and the king will come here, and it can just come to f6, then the rook could just block on g4, and as we'll see, this is why it's important that the king is 2 files off, because if the king were on e7, the king could just go to f7 and it would be a simple draw. But here, Botvinnik is just threatening to promote. A really instructive play from Botvinnik, and we can see all throughout the opening and middle game how they all flowed into the end game, and Botvinnik had some really nice tactics in this position. He just got his knight to c5, and he came up with knight captures on b7 and then king captures on c6, exploiting the back ring where the rook had moved away from, and now queen to d8, and basically these transformations led to this winning position, and he got his rook behind his passed pawn. But the even more important moment was here when he played rook to e1, and now he transferred his rook to e6, because this pawn couldn't be captured because of this trade into the pawn endgame, where the king would just come to f5 and it would just be a winning position. And rook now defend pawn on e6, and now he comes up with the breakthrough in the position, and he trades a few pawns, but he knows that as long as his king is in front of the pawn, then it would be a draw. If black's king was able to get in front of this pawn, then black would be able to make a draw. But here you can see how this rook is cutting the king off, and black has no way to come in and get behind this pawn. So a really nice technique from Botvinnik here, and he just won the game in a very instructive manner. And that's all for today. Bye.